class, this is Susan Priest, and in this week we're looking at moral philosophy and kind of looking at some of the big topics, the 5 moral frameworks, and I'm going to do just a little bit of historical review, and we're going to be looking at mostly virtue ethics, deontological ethics, and consequentialism, but some other things in there. So there's a TV show that I'm going to recommend that people see, which is called The Good Place. In particular, season 3, which is 2018, season 3, episode 5, is really good because it gives a very quick summary of deontological ethics, virtue ethics, and consequentialism, all in this span of like 15 minutes. So I highly recommend this show, which is mostly a reflection about moral philosophy, and it's very funny and light. The 5 main ethical frameworks, generally speaking, in ethics are seen as divine command ethics, which is basically, you should do whatever God ordains. Now, then, of course, the question comes in, which God are you referring to, and how do we know? But that's more of a religious viewpoint on where the justification for morality comes in. Then the last one on the list, relativism, is less of a philosophical approach and more of a cultural approach, which is basically the idea that I should do what my culture or society thinks I should do. And it's okay if one society or culture has different views than another. So it's no problem that in our culture, female genital mutilation is not okay, whereas in some African countries it is. That's relativism. But for most of your energy, I want you to be understanding the 3 major philosophical frameworks. Consequentialism, which is looking at the consequences, so that what you choose to do is morality is assessed based on the outcome of that act. So I should do whatever has the most desirable consequences. Then secondly, there's deontological ethics, which is probably the most challenging one to understand. It's also essentially, the writings of Immanuel Kant and his work on the categorical imperative. And he was trying to create an ethical system which was universal and did not rely on a belief in a God. So basically, I should do what it is my moral duty to do. And we'll talk a little bit later about how one ascertains what one's duty is. And then finally, the 3rd major philosophical framework is virtue ethics. What would the virtuous person do? What kind of person should I be? And we're going to see there's radically different viewpoints in virtue ethics, everywhere from Aristotle and Plato to Nietzsche. So we'll look at that. So if you want, there's 3 main periods of time that we're looking at, just as a kind of quickie review. So I'm going to talk to you about some ideas from ancient Greece, Christian ethics, and also Jewish and Islamic ethics. We're going to be looking at just briefly. I'm going to give you some heads up on that, which roughly spans the 4th through the 13th centuries. And then we see from the 7th to the 19th is where the more virtue ethics, deontology, and consequentialism really come into play. So during the Greek period, I would say it's mostly of virtue ethics. So now remember, with Plato and his idea about the theory of forms, he says that the ultimate form is the form of good. So goodness is the apex. But out of that, he said there are four main virtues. So temperance or moderation, courage, wisdom, and justice. So think about this. Ask yourself, do you consider those to be virtues? Now, Aristotle actually did not deviate too much from Plato in respect to his ideals of virtue. But we do get a little bit more nuanced explanation of the middle path of virtue with Aristotle, because he talks about, remember we read in the Nicomachean Ethics that that what is moral and good is a balance between the extremes of lack or excess. So courage is the midpoint between doing nothing and reckless behavior. So, but we see more and more that with Aristotle, he develops a more thoroughgoing kind of virtue ethics. Rather than some abstract universal construct to obey, you just have to practice the habits and the behaviors of virtuous ethics or a virtuous person. And then we can get to see that the moral judgments are really judgments of fact about the natural world, right? There's some advantages to temperance, courage, which is neither apathy or recklessness. Now, there's two groups of thought that we haven't really read about, but I just wanted to mention because they're very interesting. And they come about 2nd century BCE, so a little bit after Plato and Aristotle. The Epicureans, and the Epicureans were seen as people who said that you should search for desire. You should do things and pursue desires, and that should be your kind of moral imperative. Now, sometimes people misinterpret this as being hedonists, but that's not actually what Epicureans were. Epicurus from the 2nd century said there are three kinds of desire, and really there's only one that we should pursue. He thought we should pursue. So the first type, needed and natural, we should pursue these. So that might include, food, water, shelter, sexual relations for procreation purposes. You get the idea. But he said that then there's two other types of desires that are problematic. The first one, natural but not needed, like overeating, overindulging in food and drink. Those are problematic. And then he said there's plenty of desires that we have that are neither natural nor needed, and that we do not need to pursue these. So Epicureans might be skewed to be called hedonists, but that would be an inaccurate assessment of who they are. And then there's the Stoics. Now, Stoicism was very popular in the Roman legion, so in this early period. And they were fatalists. Whatever happens is the inevitable outcome of the logic of the universe. Accept and act accordingly. So we can see they had a different sort of spin on what it means to be virtuous. So I've given you a sample of four different religious ethicists. First we have St. Augustine, who believed that moral evil comes about when men and women turn away from God. He said that we have this natural tendency toward going after things that are keeping us separate from God, that we have a desire for things that keep us separated from God, and this is the real problem. Al-Ghazali, who was a Muslim ethicist, actually appealed back to the four Platonic virtues of courage, temperance, wisdom, and justice. So he saw the value in those ancient Greek beliefs of appealing to virtuous behavior. Moses Maimonides, who was a Jewish philosopher around the same time in the Middle Ages, um, summarized essential Jewish belief. There's not a lot um, that you can say. Uh, two assertions that Maimonides made was that God is one. That's important. And God gave law to Moses. So the law of the Ten Commandments, the laws of the Levitical codes, these are the rules to live by in the Jewish community. And then finally we have St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, who really took Aristotle's ideas and added Christianity to them and created some of his own unique ideas. And he said that natural law is the law of reason, and divine law is God's gift to humans. And we appeal to both. So now we turn to what's considered the modern philosophical era. So basically 17th century forward, 1600s forward. So we're going to talk a lot more about Thomas Hobbes next week when we get to political philosophy, but it's important to understand his basic idea of humanity. You could say that somebody's ideology of their what's human nature is very indicative or predictive of what someone's political philosophy will be. So moral philosophy is more about how should individuals act, and political philosophy is more about how should societies act. So remember, Hobbes said everything is material. He did not believe in a soul. And he believed that basically human beings, that all of our activity goes to promote our self-interest above all else. So, you know, that Gollum character from The Lord of the Rings, that's kind of it's similar to Schopenhauer, this idea that we just want what we want, and that's how we roll. Now, David Hume, the Scottish philosopher, did not create a big, grand ethical system, but I think it's interesting to note that he believed that moral judgments come from emotion, not reason. We are morally sensitive creatures. What do you think about that? But probably the most celebrated ethicist from the 18th century is Immanuel Kant, the German Immanuel Kant. And he created the system of deontological or duty ethics. And his main vehicle for doing this was what is called the categorical imperative. And the categorical imperative was this idea that if you are going to determine what is your moral duty, you have to think about it in terms of what kind of impact would it have if everyone did it. So it's a little speculative, but the focus is on thinking about how what you're doing should be determined by the goodness of the act itself, not by the outcome of the act. So I know that it's wrong to pick flowers in my neighbor's yard without asking, because I can imagine through this process of the categorical imperative that if I took flowers without asking and everybody else in the block did it, there would be no flowers left. So this is a one way of, so even if it would provide a lot of happiness to me or some other people, it doesn't matter. It might not even matter if I knew that my neighbor wouldn't mind. That's what's really interesting, because ultimately I know that it's not the right thing to do without asking. Okay, so 18th and 19th centuries, we have two very famous British utilitarians, Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill. So Jeremy Bentham, who was considered an act utilitarian, we get a little bit more about the differentiation between act and rule utilitarians in an article that you read for this week. But the act utilitarians say that, or Jeremy Bentham in particular said that happiness equals pleasure. And the rightness of an act is based on the effect of general happiness. So the whole idea is that you want to choose an act that will create the most happiness for the most people. Whereas John Stuart Mill, later contemporary of Jeremy Bentham, said that some pleasures are inherently better than others. There are some things, and we should create rules that predict that follow a schema or some sort of systematic thought that has some sort of internal logic to it. So both with act utilitarians and rule utilitarians, both with Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, both of their theories are considered consequentialist theories because they are looking at the outcome. They're looking at what is produced from the act, not what the act is in and of itself. Now, Friedrich Nietzsche, which we talked about last week, had a completely different view of ethics. But I think it's fair to say he's representing a different kind of virtue ethics, in that he is advising, purporting, recommending a striving towards excellence in all things, and not mediocrity, not the middle way, but the most passionate way forward. So in his work, it contrasts the Apollonian principle of Greek philosophy, which is more staid, and the Dionysian principle of Greek philosophy, which is more passionate and out there. And he says that the master morality is all about pushing yourself, becoming the best you can be, whereas slave morality is following the herd and doing what you do because that's what everyone does. So he has a different view of what it means to be a virtuous person. An interesting counterpoint to Plato, Aristotle, and some others. So all of the articles that you read this week, or were assigned to read for the most part, were by 20th century writers, but they're really helping us understand some different facets of ethical questions. So in Honora O'Neill's summary of Kant's ethics, she focuses mainly on the idea that Kant has, that the problem that deontologists have with utilitarians is that utilitarians are looking at the effect or the consequence of their behavior, and sometimes that means they're using people as a means to an end rather than but the Kant and the Kantians think that the end does not justify the means. So another way of looking at how you determine what is ethical is by saying, if I am using people as a means to an end, there's something wrong. So a Kantian would never lie. Lying is not good. It's lying. Now, whereas a utilitarian might say that maybe it's ethical to lie and protect someone's feelings. So notice that. Louis Pojman does a nice job of assessing and defending utilitarianism against many of its claims. And I think he does a good job of talking about the main differences between act and rule utilitarianism. So definitely review that carefully. And then we have Virginia Held, who is a 20th century philosopher who is saying, there's a problem when we create ethical systems which rely on universals, creating universals. So consequentialists and deontologists rely on universals. They want to say, we need a system. And Virginia Held said the problem is when we do that, we sometimes ignore the fact that we are relational creatures. Human beings are relational creatures, and we can't always we can't just apply universal truths because we're in relationship with people, and we can see that the relationship and of caring for those that we're in relationship with is important. So very interesting approach, different approach to philosophy. It'd be interesting to hear where you think you would categorize this ethics of care. Is it more utilitarian or consequentialism? Is it more virtue ethics? What do you think about that? And then in the article by James Rachels, he really defines the difference between psychological egoism, which is behavior is motivated by self-interest, which is what Thomas Hobbes says, and ethical egoism, which is the people who believe that you should only be concerned with self-interest. Right. Little bit of Nietzsche in there. So one of the great ways to explore moral philosophy is to apply it in certain realms. So to be thinking about how would Aristotle respond to any effort to alleviate poverty? What would the Stoics say? Would they say just buck up? What do you think? What would Nietzsche say? And what would Virginia Held say? Would they have different views? So the other thing that would be interesting, and these are, I'm not going to answer them for you. I'm just posing them for you to think about. Maybe you'll see them later on some test. Nudge, nudge, wink, wink. What would Jeremy Bentham say about global warming? What should we be doing? What would Peter Singer say? That's one of the articles in the section 9 that you could have chosen for your essay 3. What would Immanuel Kant say? What should we do? Should we do anything? How should we act?